All right, so Eamon, just quickly at the top before we get really bogged down in the hottest 100 chat and Splendour, quick question for you. Do you think in the world there are more doors or wheels?
Wow. I'm not good with these because I think too much about them. Where you're like, oh, just looking for a quick response. I'm like, oh no, da, da, da. There has to be more. Ah,
Because you
well,
think, right,
I have to say
a
more wheels.
car, a car has four wheels, normally four doors, sometimes two.
Yep.
You look at a house, not many wheels in a house unless it's on a chair, like a desk chair, which will have probably 6 or 8 wheels on it, but plenty of doors.
Plenty of doors, but like, how many wheels do we count? Like, what about the wheels on like a cavity slider door, like a sliding door? But
Yeah.
when you like think about an office building,
I
doors,
know.
doors, doors, like 50-story. But I think over everything, when you include all of the engineering things that exist in this world, or the little tools and machinery and gears and bare wheels and bearings and stuff, that there'd be more things spinning in order to keep us moving than doors opening. That's my guess.
Yes. I was going to try and turn that real philosophical, but decided against it. But yeah, more, just keep the world spinning. Don't worry about opening doors. I don't know. But yeah, I think I agree with you. More wheels than doors. But, I think of a bus. You're like, there's only, 2 doors on that, lots more wheels.
B double, like a semi, that's 18 wheels on average, and there's only like
Yeah.
2 doors
To
on
the
the
one
front, maybe
door.
3, 4.
Yeah. Skateboards, all wheels, baby.
Yeah. Do you
Bike.
actually have the answer to this?
No, I don't actually know. Let me do a quick Google and see if it tells me. But
Did you come up with this question?
no, I heard it said somewhere else. But um, yeah, there's no. I mean, there would be a conclusive answer, but no one on the internet seems to be providing me with an answer.
It's a pretty honestly difficult thing to measure. I mean, everyone could estimate, but how do we really know? There's not like a universal stock take for all wheel distributors of varying sizes and shapes and forms, nor is there a universal log of how many doors have been sold globally, I don't think.
Yeah. Also, an interesting point that someone's raised is that Lego is actually the largest manufacturer of wheels in the world.
Right.
So when you consider that fact, and how many doors are they manufacturing?
Not as many, I don't imagine. Wheels for Lego.
Yeah,
That's for their set.
apparently.
Okay. It's a fancy.
So I would
Yeah.
think wheels and that sort of outnumbered doors. But anyway,
Either way, I'd say if we
let
were
us know
to,
what your thoughts are in the comments. Let us know.
yeah. And actually, while we're talking to you, the listener, thanks to those who have already signed up to our new Patreon as
Hey.
well. We have enjoyed seeing some of you come on and support us in a small way, and some in a bigger way than we expected. So, very, very much appreciate that. We're kind of getting it's very, very helpful. In short, in terms of the various subscriptions and things we need to pay to keep all of our things happening. And you can rest assured that money from that will go back into what we make. We're not just like putting an extra $10 in our pocket a month or anything of that nature. So thank
No.
you very much. And if you do want to join us, the link is, Cam, I can't remember, patreon.com/homebrewed.
Or maybe Homebrewed Media.
Homebrewed Media.
It'll be in the link down below in the show notes or description, wherever you're listening or watching this. That's where there'll be a link where you can find it on our Instagram page as well. But just quickly on that, if you were turned off because it was US dollars, not AUD, that's my bad. I'll put my hand up for that and apologize. But rest assured that is currently in the process of being fixed. So if you thought, I don't want to pay for the dollar conversion rates, and we were being charged on our end as well for the conversion rates. So we didn't intentionally set it up like that. That was just an oversight on my part. So hopefully by the time this comes out, that issue will be fixed. So if you do want to donate and contribute to our Patreon in Australian dollars, which is what we would prefer as well, hopefully that will be fixed and sorted by the time we get there.
Yes, definitely. That was, just a bit of a boo-boo we didn't realize because they're both dollars. So, don't blame us. Blame whoever named our currency the same as the US's.
There was something in the page set up that it was default to US dollars and I just never changed it. So my bad.
It's okay. We're getting there now. But yeah, we are this evening, as Cam foreshadowed. It's not even the evening when we're recording this. I don't know why I said this evening. And it could be any
Old
time
habits
given this
die hard.
podcast. That does. We are tonight, this evening, this morning, whenever you're listening, discussing the elephant in the room, of course, which will be... Well, there's actually two elephants in the room in the last week of Australian music, I'd say. And we're talking about both of them. Of course, the Hottest 100 just went down the weekend just gone. You'll be hearing this on Thursday. It happened on Saturday. And before that, last week, on about a week ago from the release of this one, Splendour in the Grass also announced that it will not be going ahead for a second year straight. They didn't go to lineups, they didn't go to ticket releases and then pull the pin after that. They've made a call, just looking at the landscape, that it's not going to go ahead. So we'll be covering both of those. There's the Hottest 100 in a lot more detail, I think, because there's been a lot of interesting stuff around it, in the fallout, as there always is, which, is an important note as well. But I was listening to that countdown up at Hawk's Nest on the weekend. Went up there for a mate's birthday and we were playing golf at the time. Also at the time, the Central Coast Mariners were playing Wellington Phoenix in Christchurch. And I uniquely was able to be disappointed in three different ways at the same time. The Mariners drew 0-0, which I suppose the draw is all right, but, it wasn't exactly the most fantastic game. The Hottest 100 it's always a good listen, but, we're going to get into, it was a little bit disappointing in terms of some of the artists that I personally would have liked to have seen in there, and Australian content generally. And, of course, I was playing golf, which meant that I was disappointed because of how I was playing golf. I did redeem it later on in the day, but at the time the countdown was on, actually countdown was still on this point. Anyway, I was being disappointed 3 times at once. So that's an interesting little fun bit of my weekend. But people were listening in a range of different ways. And I suppose, Cam, we were speaking before we hit record about how the ways that we listen are maybe dictating or reflecting how much we care or listen to Triple J.
Yeah, I don't really, I haven't dived in, and I'm not doing a, full university level thesis on this, but at a, just something I've noticed, I think 2021, 2022 were probably 2 of the years where I was most into the countdown, where I was like, hey, I need to, actually listen to the countdown, and I'm excited by potentially songs in my top 10. Where are they going to place? Where this year I was at a family event down at Brooklyn. I was not listening. I was just sort of checking the app every, 20 minutes or so, just seeing where songs were being placed and how the countdown was progressing. And that could be, as you mentioned, a few things. One, when I look back to 2021, 2022 was probably when I was listening to Triple J the most. Where this year I've barely listened to Triple J. I'm just much more on listening to podcasts and, my own libraries when I'm commuting. And it could also be a factor of when I look at the top 100 from this year, only one song that I voted for made it, and that was in at number 2 for Royal Otis's Like a Version, Murder on the Dance Floor, which some people are even opposed to Like a Version's being eligible for a countdown, let alone, that being, that's a whole different discussion. But when I look at the top 100, then there aren't too many songs in there that excite me either. So It could just be I'm getting old. It could just be, I'm not listening to the station as much, so I'm not as engaged in the countdown. There's a few different factors at play.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting. There's so much to unpack from this countdown. I suppose the big glaring issue that a lot of people are pointing out with the results, and I mean, like, yeah, it's results. We're not like people go a bit crazy with this stuff. The results of it are that it was the lowest amount of Australian songs in the countdown since 1996, and the lowest amount of Australian artists ever in the countdown. Which is obviously disappointing, especially for people like us who kind of are there solely because of Australian music and for Australian music. And obviously opinions have flown thick and fast, as they do every year. People are alleging that Triple J isn't focusing on local talent enough, that they're too influenced by overseas artists and trends, that too many non-Triple J listeners are voting in the countdown. People have said it was just a freakishly good year for international pop acts in terms of how many, culturally significant albums were released and music was released. And another one that's an interesting concept as well is the traditional Aussie indie sounds. You kind of know what I'm talking about when I say that, although we definitely produce all kinds of sounds in Australia, but the ones that rise to the top often have a similar, not similar sound, but they can kind of be put into a similar box, I suppose. That those sounds are resonating less with audiences. And yeah, there's a few interesting responses to that, but does any of those jump out at you, Cam? Did you find yourself leaning on any of those when you were kind of reflecting on the results?
Well, I actually think all of the above were thoughts that came to my head. I did have all of those, and we've even discussed some of those issues in different music newses or with interviews that we've done. But when you actually look into the data on, because there was a lot of Triple J just bowing to the trends of TikTok and globalization, and they're not playing any Aussie artists. There was actually, when you look at the top 10 artists played on Triple J in 2024, 6 of them didn't crack the hottest 100. So you have The Boys at 10, Romeo Wolf at 9, Cosmo's Midnight, Billie Eilish in at 7, who had 8 songs and broke a really long-standing record held by the Hilltop Woods. 6 Teenage Dads, they didn't make the countdown, which I was very upset about on a personal note. The Kid Laroi, Hockey Dad, Royal Lotus had 4 songs, Psycho had none, Lime Cordial had 2. So Hockey Dad also not featuring in the hottest 100, although they did feature quite a bit in the 101 to 200 countdown, but didn't crack the hottest 100. So that signifies to me that it's not Triple J not supporting Australian artists, because when you go through that top 10, the bulk of them there are Australian. I think it was only, Billie Eilish.
8 out of 10 are Australian in that top 10 artists that were played.
Yeah.
And we know, Nick Finlay, who's the head of music or the music director at Triple J, recently said in an interview that their quota is to play 40% Australian music. They play over 50% weekly. So I think that argument is a bit shit. We can put that one to bed that they're not playing enough Australian music. I think there's perhaps more to be said about, the focusing or like, what kind of a product is offered and how that compares to commercial counterparts in terms of what big international pop artists they are playing. But you cannot argue they're not playing enough or focusing on enough Australian music. And I think with this, like, it's that same old thing. People just want to like rush to be like, it's this, and it's this one definable, clearly, easily answerable problem, and it's with Triple J or it's with something else. But I think, like everything, that this is a much more nuanced kind of issue that's a lot more complex. It's got a bit of shades of everything in it, which we've been kind of speaking about in different forms over the last 12 months. But we did come across, so we give some credit early to who we're going to reference in a lot of our discussion here. Joe Hardy, who's a Sydney-based music blogger and I guess just advocate for the industry. He has a blog post called Triple J's Hottest 100 for 2024 is a damning statement on the erosion of local culture. He's done some really interesting kind of quick research on this that we're going to reference. I would really encourage everyone to go and have a look at that post on his blog. It's called joe.blog. Should get
Which
you
is
to it.
great. For if your name's Joe and you have a blog, you have to call it Joe Blog.
Yeah.
That's just it's that already enough was that was enough for me to go, all right, this guy might have something good to say.
Definitely. And we're also drawing on a couple of pieces from the music.com.au, which do some great Australian music reporting. So just keep that in mind. Check out those sources as well as we run through what we are going to pick out. Now, starting with Joe, he had just some interesting kind of side bits of data on this in his analysis, which was showing that the average distance of time from the poll of the artists, from the poll, as in the Hottest 100, to the artist's first ever release. And this is including all of the 18 Australian artists that made it into the countdown. So the average time from when they first ever released a song to when they featured in the Hottest 100, 10.39 years. So that means the 18 acts that did chart in the Hottest 100 have been recording and releasing for an average of more than 10 years. And just for comparison, the average number since their first release in 1996 was 5.25. And in 2014, that was a huge year. There was 60 tracks from 38 Australian artists, more than double what we've got this year. 6 artists had released their first ever track in the previous year, which meant that like brand new acts were really featuring in the Hottest 100. I thought that was just an interesting bit of data that I hadn't considered. And the point he was making in that was that, you know, it's kind of a little less new and a little less contemporary when these artists are all decade-old artists who are finally, well, not all, but averaging decade-old artists who are finally featuring in the countdown.
Yeah, because when you look at, you know, the artists who did feature in this year's countdown, who I guess debuted somewhat recently, you got Royal Otis, who debuted in 2019, G Flip at 2018, then Old Merv, Pacific Avenue, and Fisher in 2017. Fisher career started in 2012, but went solo in 2017. So they're the more recent ones. But when you're looking back, you know, Missy Higgins might skew the data a little bit. She started in 2004, but Lime Cordiale 2009, Ballpark Music 2008. So when you look at the outliers there of G Flip, Royal Otis, Pacific Avenue, Old Mervs, they're sort of the 4 that have broken through to break into the Hottest 100, where, you know, your old staples, I guess, of Ballpark Music, Missy Higgins, Ocean Alley with 2011, Lime Cordiale 2004, the Rubens, Troye Sivan, you know, they're sort of your more established artists. So I don't know, there's fewer artists who are breaking through the global, I was going to say psyche, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean? Like there's less artists being able to break through and become household names to people who don't just listen to Triple J, because that was one of the other factors here, was that the countdown isn't just for Triple J listeners, it's for all Australians. So all Australians typically don't listen, well, they don't listen to Triple J. So there is going to be a wider viewpoint from music there. So the ones who are actually breaking through, you know, Royal Otis have had a massive last couple of years. Their Like a Version went absolutely insane. Number 2, obviously, on the countdown. And then you've got your older staple artists as well, who are still having cultural relevance to those who are household names. Did any of that rambling make sense?
It did. Basically, yeah, the cut through of it's particularly new Australian artists in 2025 and 2024 Australia is limited pretty much to Triple J alone. And what the results of the Hottest 100 show us is that it doesn't really reflect Triple J anymore, because you do have so many people voting, which is a good thing. Like we constantly have to be reminded that it's a popularity contest, and that's who got the most votes. And what you find every year with the countdown is that it hasn't been any kind of niche thing for a long time. It's a full-on, absolute, bolted-on Australian nationwide tradition, and as a result, you're going to get tens of thousands of more people voting. for songs that they like than have actually listened to Triple J. And I know that because friends I was away with over the weekend who I know don't really ever listen to Triple J had voted. So that's definitely reflective of what's going on. And what Joe Hardy kind of lands on in this blog is that, we can only really view the results of this as a reflection of the people who voted, not much more. And I think too many people are trying to extrapolate conclusions and what that means about this and that. This just reflects who voted in it, which sounds really obvious, but when you consider that people who voted in it aren't necessarily bona fide listeners to Triple J or even supporters of Australian music, if you know what I mean, like Australians who aren't really supportive of Australian music are voting in this, that's as far as we can get with analysing the actual results.
Yeah, like to your point, though, obviously anyone can vote. When you look back at, the people who hit number one that weren't Australian, like my mind, obviously, this year we had Chapel Roan. Last year we had Paint the Town Red by Doja Cat, which that song, in my opinion, is the worst ever to win number one on the Hottest 100. Even, Billie Eilish with Bad Guy, like when those songs made number one, I was like, bugger. Wish it was an Aussie, but it wasn't. But people who are voting for those songs, as you mentioned, Eamon, likely don't have an interest in Australian music. They likely just listen to commercial radio, or they get their music tastes and trends off, Spotify algorithms or TikTok or just whatever's popular. And, that I think that's probably something that when we look back to the 2014 Hottest 100 countdown referenced in Joe's blog here, where he said the average age from, as we mentioned, the career length to their debut was 4.1 years 10 years ago, and now it's 10.3. So I think the globalization and TikTok and digital trends have probably impacted how little Australian artists are able to cut through.
Yeah. I think that's where we should be landing with this. It's that Australian music isn't significant for Australians anymore. Pretty much. That is the crux of it. So to see this vote as more representative of wider Australia than it is actually of Triple J listeners, which it is, then we say that for those people, Australian music is nowhere near as important, at least this year. But I mean, if we're going to look at a couple of other trends that kind of we've been speaking about over the last 12 months or so that show that this is probably more a reflection of the impact had by globalizing music and the way trends and music is disseminated and picked up now, which is via social media platforms and also via streaming services, of course, and namely algorithms, which dictates what we listen to across all of those platforms. It is algorithms. And so that's what these results tell us. But while this has been going on for some years now, I think there's a lot of culpability on Australians and I sort of maybe less so Australians people, but like the people who are in control of perhaps getting music out there. They've done nothing to try and counter that or balance that or push Australian music harder. And I mean, so often with these things that it is sound advice, it's buy merch, buy tickets, stream Australian music. But the fact is the way these services work and the way humans work is that that real conscious, I need to do something in order to make this difference thing is only going to work for like 10% of people. And what we really need to be doing is looking at what systems have started to fail the kind of dissemination of Australian music. Why is it reaching less and less people now? What is responsible for that and how do we fix it? And we've spoken last year a bit about the ARIA charts. Just for reference, the end of year charts for 2024, it was not a pretty sight for local Australian artists. On the singles chart, only 5 tracks were local. The highest of those was Vance Joy's Riptide at number 24, which ironically topped the Hottest 100 back in 2013. Cyril's remake of Stumblin' was in at 29. Dom Dollar saving up. Number 50, The Kid Laroi, 84 was Nights Like This. And his Justin Bieber collab, Stay, was at 96. That's of the 100 best singles of the Australian charts. So only 5 Australian songs in that, or the featured Australian artists. When it came to the albums, there was only 3 Australian albums were present. Cold Chisel's 50 Years at 44, The Kid Leroy's First Time at 67, and In Excess's The Very Best at 81. So that just tells you that Australians aren't listening to Australian music. Again, we found last year in October, a report was released by the US-based research company Ruminate. They said that Australian music ranks number 3 with Australian music streamers, which is very disappointing, making up 9.2% of what's streamed. So content from the US is 61.2% of the top 10,000 artists streaming share in Australia. UK music is 16.6%, then Australia, then Canada, then India, and then South Korea. So in our own country, we listen to 6 times more American music than we do Australian music. We listen to nearly double UK music than we do Australian music. And half of what the Australian music that we listen to, we also listen to from Canada. So 5% there. So it just does go to show that the overarching problem, if we are looking to point fingers as to why this has happened, is that Australians are not listening to Australian music very much anymore, despite the best efforts of places like Triple J, who still play a lot. But we know, as Ken, you mentioned the ratings before, that reality is not a whole lot of people listening to Triple J anymore, particularly the youth demographic. Like, I listen at work because I like to have the radio on and not, I feel like if I was to program 40 hours a week of my own listening, I'd get exhausted by the process or tired of it very soon. But when I'm in the car, I'm listening to my music streaming, or I am listening to podcasts. And I think that reflects most of our generation.
Yeah, it does. And that goes to what we spoke about with, if you listen to our interview with Luke Bevins, which dropped on Monday, he talks about sort of the globalization of streaming and how, because we're an English-speaking country, that actually influences the music we listen to, because most of the English-speaking record labels and where they're headquartered, and just if you look at the number of artists who are English-speaking, most of the majority based out of the US. So when the algorithms are figuring out what to send their Australian user base, they go, you speak English, this is an English thing, bang. And it's almost, that's how it's decided, which it shouldn't be, but that's the way that it's done. Like, my library on Spotify would be probably 95% Australian, at least of the music that I'm currently listening to. If you went back to 2016, I'd still be listening to my pop punk, 2008 days. But you know what I mean? Like, if you go back, what I'm listening to would be 95% Australian. You go on my Discover Weekly, and there wouldn't be that many Australians coming up there, which that's an issue in itself too.
Yeah, totally. I think, and then, this is a whole other question. We spoke at the end of last year about algorithms and how a lot of people thought that Sabrina Carpenter music was being kind of thrust upon them when it came to their Spotify Wrapped, and how algorithms were kind of sending them songs. In another music, literally, you go back and listen to a lot of our recent music news, and we can piece this puzzle together, because we have been talking about all these various different elements over the last 6 months or so independently. But we spoke about the Kendrick and Drake beef, and how Drake is now in court, or taking his own label to court, alleging that there was a bit of funny business going on with actually promoting Kendrick Lamar's single.
How do you think Drake felt with that song? How do you think Drake felt when that song came out? Was it 4th or 3rd in the Hottest 100 this year?
Yeah, I don't think he was very happy. We know that, that's an allegation that's been made, and that issue was kind of pushed on again by the whole Sabrina Carpenter. So are these algorithms being influenced by labels or people with power within the industry? Who is determining these algorithms and what they promote, and all of those things that come along with it? So it's a very complicated issue as to why Australians are not listening to a lot of Australian music. I mean, a lot of it we can speak to about music globalization and technology, but then when we zero it back down to the Hottest 100 countdown, to simply blame Triple J for it, I don't think is very accurate, because as we've kind of detailed, they're still doing their bit for Australian music. It's more that the listeners are not doing their bit to listen to Australian music.
Yeah, because as I mentioned the radio charts just before, and Triple J's been on a decline. Like, they're cultural relevance has been dropping for a while, and that's a point that's also raised in Joe's blog, that Triple J isn't culturally relevant anymore and hasn't been for a while, and part of that is because the digital age and TikTok, everyone is trending into the same, what's the term he used? All part of like the same ecosystem. We're all hooked into the same feed. So as opposed to there being different subcultures, not just within Australia, but even within Triple J, different subcultures, and they were quite large, where now Triple J on its own has its own culture, and that feels more reflected in the 101 to 200 countdown, as opposed to the Australian culture, which is obviously the 1 to 100 countdown. So it feels like blaming everything and all the problems that we have with the countdown on the station itself feels a little bit too far-fetched. But, they're just not, it doesn't have the same. When you go back to, 10 years ago, 2014, the cultural relevance of Triple J would have been very high, and that's why it would have taken artists less time to break through into the countdown from their debut. Compared to now, they're not as culturally relevant. People like my wife, she'll hear a song on TikTok and then she'll add it to her Spotify library. If Triple J was more culturally relevant, those artists would probably, if it's hard to make the comparison because TikTok is its own massive thing, but previously to TikTok, ways that people would find new music would be from listening to the radio or what's charting on the ARIAs. And though that would influence people's listening habits. So if that cultural relevance was still there for Triple J, or even, the ARIAs, I dare say Vance Joy's Riptide was eligible to be voted for in the countdown this year. It probably would have made the 101 to 200 countdown. It probably would have.
More than likely.
But that also, I think, goes to show the culturally insignificance of the ARIAs and everything that in Australian music that we see as important widely doesn't seem important because that's all based on TikTok and Spotify algorithms, and what's happening in America seems to be more important to the wider Australian public, and that is then reflected more so in the countdown. I feel like we're going in loops.
We've been swallowing up a lot of information ahead of this, but it is hard to kind of distill it down. I think, the conclusion that we reach, as we said, is that Australians aren't listening to Australian music, and it's because so much of those cultural touch points that used to provide it have been swallowed up by the same thing, which is basically streaming services and social media. And the issue, I think, is that we do have a lot of power for influence here in Australia, or exposure at least, and the onus really should fall down and should have fallen a long time ago to anybody, any institution, any company, any operator that is responsible for playing sound and music as part of their operations should have been had it as a part of their ethos to include Australian music. And that's where we failed as a nation, I think, in actually doing that. And it is a really big problem. I mean, Joe Blog, in his blog, in the Joe Blog, mentions that street press used to provide critical infrastructure to talk about local acts and give them an identity. This is him talking about how local music media has been destroyed. Online blogs and culture publications gave amplification to niches. We had more music on TV, which people actually watched once upon a time. And there was arts journalism in major mastheads. Now we know all of those things have gone by the wayside. Even at the ABC, the arts journalism has gone by the wayside. So we've got all of the other places that still people are influenced by, or that are able to kind of, play and publish and discuss music, are doing it less and less. Everything has been swallowed up by this kind of global digital ecosystem that is the same thing that we're all hooked into, as he mentioned. And as a result of that, we're seeing a lot less diversity in things like a nation-specific countdown. To address that, I think this is genuinely a very big cultural problem, because we don't want to be one. I mean, we're already bad enough looking like America Light, but we don't want to just become so influenced and so homogenous when next to America that it doesn't look like we have our own identity. We do need to make it so that local art is valued as part of our popular culture, and we really need to figure that out ASAP, because that, like, as we've spoken about so much, like, culture is everything. Culture is how we define and understand ourselves as a nation. It informs and influences everything, and if we just make our culture, um, to reflect America, or our culture inevitably ends up just reflecting America because of media and how media is functioning in 2025, then that's objectively going to be a very, very bad thing for Australia. We're a bit asleep at the wheel at the moment, it feels like, and this is kind of what the Hottest 100 countdown has reflected. And it's a question we need to take pretty seriously.
Yeah, because the uniqueness within Australian culture, because when you think about it now, the way that artists have to market themselves is largely through social media. And even on that scale, when you look at an Australian artist compared to the number of American and British artists who they're all trying to do the same thing because everyone has to now. Everyone has to promote their music through social media and TikTok, and labels won't allow artists to release their single until they have a certain amount of TikTok followings. Like, these are agendas being pushed from the labels who are controlling the music landscape by and large. So, and if you're an independent, you don't have a label behind you, you have to promote yourself on social media too. So everyone is using the same tools to promote themselves. How is an Australian artist going to break through in that respect? And then, the same way that, the global trends have picked up international artists, et cetera, et cetera. So the other point too, on the countdown is that that you mentioned was some people are saying, and I agree, it was just a ridiculously good year for some international pop acts. Look at Billie Eilish, we referenced her before, breaking Hilltop Hood's record for the most number of songs in a single countdown. She had 8. Charlie XCX also charted heaps. And to be fair, I'd never even heard the album, but all I heard about was Brat Summer. So the marketing, back to that point, brilliant. On Charlie XCX.
Yeah, that album was incredibly, like, in terms of like cultural significance globally, that one just dominated. And yeah, I don't know if it was, as you're saying, just like an outlier of a year, or if that's kind of artists and labels have figured out how to kind of crack that code now. We're going to see another Brat Summer equivalent next year, or this year, I should say, sorry, in terms of its cultural influence. Like, they figured out, however, they managed to crack the code to crack that code. So, yeah, or it was just one of those years where, like, the pop stars went absolutely ham singer.
Well, I think it was. And you even look at, Sabrina Carpenter, Taylor Swift, they weren't eligible. They weren't shortlisted in any of the countdown this year. If they were eligible, that would have skewed the data even more into the international pop realm. I mean, Sabrina Carpenter wasn't even an option in the votes, and she still made it like 177 or something. 177 in the 101 to 200 countdown. So that was purely write-ins. People just added it to their top 10. It wasn't even an option to select, which, again, imagine if that song was eligible, that probably would have been number 1, considering it was the most streamed song on Spotify last year as well. So I don't know, it'll be interesting to see what happens next year, whether we discontinue, whether this does continue, or whether we can look back and go, okay, it was just a crazy good year, or whether this is, the trend that we're seeing in the way that, those albums and Chapel Road, and the way that they're cutting through a global market, not just the Australian market, whether that's, that influence could continue.
Yes, and we shall see in the new year. And again, the advice is, if you want to buck this trend on a personal level, buy the tickets, buy the merch, play the music. But I don't think that's it's constructive, but I don't think it's an actual solution to this. If we really want to address this is something that's going on at a much bigger level, and we need to kind of figure out why that's happening. Because 10% of people who are motivated and committed and remember enough to make these conscious decisions in spite of their algorithms that are defining our lives, that is going to help a bit, but you're still fighting against the algorithms that are defining our lives. So until we kind of address that, and the bodies in this country that are able to influence and play local music that is significant need to be doing more and figuring out how they can do more because they are responsible for culture as well.
Yeah, and the final point that we mentioned at the start was we're getting old. And
That too.
like, I turned 30 this year. I'm no longer the target demographic for Triple J. So, of course, I'm not going to be so super psyched with the top 10 or even, those in the hottest 100. I am more likely to connect with the 101 to 200. So that is also going to be, a factor as well for my personal enjoyment of the countdown.
Yeah, totally. And that is another big thing that people kind of constantly whinge about. And it's like, mate, you're nearly 30. We're nearly 30. Both of us nearly 30. It's not going to hit in the exact same way, although we're probably maybe a bit more malleable in terms of our taste because of how much of our time we dedicate to listening to new music. The average person, which we've also discussed on Music News, has their taste locked and loaded by about age 30, and they never really ever change again in their life. So that's why as people get older, they get a lot less tolerant of new music and they're less able to understand why it's so popular. So that's
and of course, music is so subjective, and that's what makes art and creative stuff beautiful, right? Like Paint the Town Red came in at number 1. It was clearly a very popular song. I just think it's rubbish, and that's just me personally. And the Wiggles, when they won with their Like a Version, people were against that as well, possibly because it was a Like a Version. Some people just thought it was a rubbish Like a Version and only won on nostalgia. I thought it was good. It's the Wiggles, and they were covering a good song by Tame Impala. So as far as I'm concerned, that was a good song. You listening may have completely different opinions on both of those tracks, and that's the beauty of the subjectivity of music, and also the democracy of a countdown. You heard Democracy Manifest to introduce this music news. And it is a democracy at the end of the day. So, albeit not just to the Triple J audience, which I think is what causes a lot of the stir and the comments online.
Yes, indeed. But yeah, we'll wrap that chat up there. I will link that Joe Hardy's blog post in the show notes for this one. It's a very interesting read. Probably sums things up quicker than we have, although we've dove in a few different directions and drawn on some other info in this as well. But interesting discussion, and there is I think, an emerging issue culturally in this country where we're not celebrating our own art enough or listening to our own music enough, and that's actually quite serious. But we will move on to a semi-related story that's equally, I suppose, depressing, but maybe less depressing, which is like a point in itself, as Cam and I were discussing pre-record. But
Yeah.
Splendour in the Grass for the second year now is not going ahead for 2025. Now, they didn't even go with the lineup announcement. They didn't go with ticket sales. They've looked at the forecast and said, mate, we are not doing this for this year, which is very interesting.
It is. And the fact that you said this was equally more and less depressing than what we were just talking about, I think it's more depressing because obviously, the festival isn't going ahead, but it's also both more and less depressing because it feels like there wasn't as much of a reaction to this piece of news as maybe there should have been. It was almost like, oh yeah, okay. It was almost expected that you hear another festival cancelling and you go, oh well, they're not coming back again this year. I guess that's that. Like, we're almost expecting festival cancellations. So when we heard this news, the reaction was, yeah, sad, but not as sad as perhaps it should have been because, 2 years in a row now without one of the biggest festivals in the country, not only can that tie into what we were talking about Australian music exposure and the chances and pathways that it provides to Australian musicians to advance their careers overseas and here in Australia, but it's also, what does it mean for the future of Splendour? 2 years in a row with no festival, is that it done for good, or is that the end of Splendour as we know it, and they're going to come back with a different method, which feels like they have to, right? If they've cancelled 2 years in a row, they can't come back for a third, in next year and have it be the same as it was before they cancelled.
Yeah, I'm in that school of thought. I think that it's the end of Splendour as we know it. I think that how we know Splendour is gone. Whether that's true or not, we'll see, but that's just how I view it. I think there's no way that they can do this 2-year cancellation in a row after a tumultuous COVID influence a few years prior. I think this year's cancellation accepts that that model is not going to work again. And as we just discussed with all of the chatter around the Hottest 100, the way we listen to and consume music is changing very rapidly. So I just don't think that that model's fit for purpose anymore. Now, that's not to say they won't come back in 2026 or 2027, but I think they will, if they do, looking quite different. I think they're going to have to take notes from events like Meredith, which we've discussed on the show before, which sell out every single year still because they have this very well-defined kind of ethos. They're smaller, they're more boutique. The artists are all kind of, they're not all the same by any means at all, but in terms of their status, their potential, their niche, they're all hand-selected and curated in a very specific way to create a very specific vibe that keeps people coming back year after year. And I think that's not what Splendour was doing. And the Australian festival scene generally was a lot about, like, you know, here's this hip hop artist, here's this electronic artist, here's this rock artist, here's this indie artist, here's this pop artist. They're all on the same bill. Everybody can go and enjoy. I feel like that model might be just about done in Australia, with this news kind of confirming it moving forward.
Yeah, because obviously Splendour not the only festival on this scale and with that method to struggle to sell tickets. I mean, I know a lot of people said, I'm not going to spend, you know, on a multi-day festival, I'm not going to spend upwards of $500 for a ticket and camping and everything. And the headline is Kylie Minogue, which, no shade at Kylie Minogue, obviously a fantastic artist in her own right, but not really one that's going to attract a lot of people who would go to Splendour and these sorts of festivals to fork out lots of money in a cost of living crisis. It's not really, you know, the lineup itself, I think, was a little bit underwhelming, and you've obviously also mentioned the method and the, you know, the type of festival that they are, that could and likely should be adapting, I think, moving forward. Here's a random hypothetical for you, since I tend to like these recently. I don't know why, but I like throwing hypothetical questions at you. Big Day Out, right? 2013, I think, was the last installment of Big Day Out before it was cancelled.
Yep.
If Big Day Out came back this year or next year with the exact same format that it had with similar types of big names, so in 2013, they had Red Hot Chili Peppers, The Killers, Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Vampire Weekend, Bands of Authors. Very hot on the Sydney Big Day Out too. It was 40 odd degrees. It was disgusting. But if they came back, that scale of festival, similar sort of headliners, mixed in with obviously, you know, the Australian artists that they had at the time as well. I mean, look back, Childish Gambino was on that lineup and he's fourth from the bottom, fourth line from the bottom. He'd come back now and be a headline. And that's also the beauty of these, and, you know, Splendour. You can look back to a Splendour 10 years ago when someone who was barely, you know, focused, you know, you have to really zoom in to see their name clearly on the poster. They're now a headliner. That's also, you know, what we're probably lacking with these festivals being canned as well. But do you think if Big Day Out came back in 2025 or 2026 with the exact same product, that they would succeed?
Yeah, I think for at least a year or two, yes, because of the name alone and the nostalgia factor. But enduring, I don't know. And like they used to be able, I mean, like Red Hot Chili Peppers and The Killers, massive international acts. Like they were able to attract those huge international acts that are going to pull people in, which we've kind of seen diminishing with Australian festivals in recent years. And again, to tie it back into our conversation about the Hottest 100, I think competition for some of those biggest artists in the world is a lot stiffer now because Australia is very hard to travel to, and there's kind of less diversity in who the world beaters are at any given time. So to get those on your bill, you're competing with everybody else in the world. From an artist perspective, they're probably getting paid more and have to do less travel to go somewhere else that's offering them that. So I think being able to actually pull these artists is getting harder as the pool the kind of global pool of music that people are listening to somewhat narrows, or at least in a popular sense, if you know what I mean. So I think that's another factor to it. But yeah, I do think it would. I think it would sell at least for a couple of years.
I agree, actually. I think, yeah, but purely based on nostalgia and the name of it, not necessarily because of the model.
Yeah, yeah. But it is. I mean, and the one positive way we can look at this, it's like, yeah, now you mentioned that kind of muted response that people had to the news that it's being cancelled again, which is disappointing. But I suppose everyone's not surprised, and I think it already means that maybe people have moved on, that people have grieved,
Yeah.
people are over it now, and they're looking for whatever is new to come around. And some of the conversations we had last year, a lot of people we spoke to kind of went back to that, where yes, this is disappointing right now. It's a really not a good time, but this could be like the Enlightenment, the Australian music Enlightenment, where we kind of level up in terms of what the product being offered. So maybe 10 years from now, we'll see this as the kind of dip that we had to have in order for a lot of events to reinvent themselves and a lot of new things to emerge that are going to be far more compelling as a product and be better for music as a product as well. Because there was definitely criticisms of a lot of those lineups favoring older artists for the pull factor, or one hit wonders of whom people only know one song to sell tickets, where everyone runs to the amphitheatre at North Byron Parklands to listen to that one song and then leaves afterwards, basically. So, there was a lot of criticisms before this that maybe the model wasn't ideal, although it can't be understated how much it did do for exposure to local acts. So many people would find Australian artists via that. But yeah, maybe this is the darkness before the dawn, and we are about to see festivals come back, reimagined, events look really different, much more sophisticated and better, and we'll be grateful almost that this happened down the track. Now, that is one very positive way to look at it, or we could just be in a doom spiral. I don't know.
Yeah, I hope the optimism does come true, but I fear, looking at this, I can see a lot of parallels to COVID, right? So the first time Splendour was cancelled, when Groovin was cancelled, that was like when we found out Tom Hanks had COVID, and when all of the sports in the world started to stop, we were like, oh shit, hang on. Something's happening here. This is big. And then by the time Splendour cancels for 2 years in a row, it's sort of like, yeah, I know, I get it. There's more cases in the state. I'm a bit overhearing about it. And coming back now with a reimagined could be exciting. But I do fear that, yeah, people are now desensitized to it. And, these similar conversations came about. We spoke about it on radio during the pandemic, that people, once live music's available again, oh, it's going to be thriving. It's going to be awesome. And it was for maybe a month or two. People were getting back out there. It was, oh, how cool is this? And now we can see what's happened to the landscape, because contract workers left during the pandemic because they weren't getting paid. Artists, it became too hard for them. They had to find other income, and then they stopped having time for music. We saw, obviously, then the cost of living impact sort of had as a result of that as well, like the flow-on effects from COVID. And I fear we could have similarly detrimental flow-on effects from these festivals being cancelled, and that the future could end up being that there's only, there's no major festivals in Australia anymore. But maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need just a bunch of boutique festivals all around the country to sort of bring it their own culture. And maybe that's how we can reconnect to local culture and sort of build it up again that way. I don't know. We're mixing optimism and pessimism. A little bit of optimism with extreme pessimism, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, and that very well could go that way. But as you say, I suppose, yeah, maybe all of our trends, and as it in COVID, and habits change to the point where, you got a whole generation of people who are hitting that prime festival going age, where they've had 3 years without the biggest ones in the country, and that's not part of their habits. That's not what their group of friends do every year. And we kind of lose that proper. But yeah, I mean, people have always wanted to listen to music in large groups. So yeah, it might hopefully just change form. But yeah, we will see. When it comes to Splendour specifically, it's very difficult to imagine it coming back in the same way. Now, I think if they had it tried again this year and it pulled it off, maybe we would have seen that model kick on. But that 2 years in a row, the lack of confidence in their own model, as it was, is telling. I think we for them to survive and that name to survive and continue, it's going to have to come back looking pretty different to how we know it.
This could be the hand sanitizer. We all thought during the pandemic that, well, the good thing out of this is we're all now in the habit of sanitizing our hands and, covering our faces when we cough and sneeze and all that. That'll continue well beyond the pandemic. That's the good news out of it. And then as soon as you stopped having hand sanitizer stations at every shop that you walked into, and no one continued to do it. It all stopped, and we went back to our normal grubby lives like we did before the pandemic. So any optimism that we have for the music trends shifting as a result of this might be misplaced optimism, but
we shall see. That's a maybe optimistic, definitely pessimistic, potentially note to wrap things up. But food for thought, and hopefully it's at least got you thinking about these things. I mean, particularly with the Hottest 100 stuff, try not to jump to that, knee-jerk blame game reaction, and try and think about maybe what we've spoken about and how this issue is much bigger than just, whether they played too much Chapel Roan or Billie Eilish on Triple J in one particular year, etc., etc. Because these are kind of like existential issues relating to Australian music right now that we need everybody to be thinking about and talking about and working on. So, yeah,
here's the thing: we're just two guys who have a passion for Australian music. We don't have any real connections or sway within the industry.
Yeah.
You listening, you're likely in a very similar boat. And really, we're preaching to the choir, I feel, with our audience. If you're listening to this podcast, you're already sort of on board and aware of a lot of the stuff that we do talk about and cover. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm too sad now to continue on. So maybe we just
look,
end this here, and
count on us.
Maybe I'll continue thinking about whether there's more doors or wheels in the world, and that'll get me motivated again.
Definitely. That's an interesting thing to ponder. And in the meantime, you can count on us to continually deliver you interviews with artists from this country, and a lot of them from the Central Coast too. So keep us on your feeds if you want to keep consuming Australian music and Australian music content, because that is part of the puzzle. So the only way to save Australian music is to listen to us, is the conclusion you should be naturally drawing from this.
And to subscribe to our Patreon.
And that too. But yeah, please do like our stuff, share it, subscribe it. If you do like it, tell people about it, etc. And we will keep discussing these things with varying degrees of sense making and varying degrees of rambling. And hopefully at the other end of it, you are still happy.
Yes, hopefully. But thank you. Sincerely, thank you for listening to this episode and enduring through the ramble. How much ramble will be left in and how much will be edited out is yet to be seen, but there was a lot of rambling throughout the recording of this podcast. So we do thank you for enduring us and for listening to these episodes. You're a VIP in our eyes. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time.
See you then.